In this week's AMT Insight, I'll be discussing the recent developments in the magnesium market and the threat that this might pose to base metals demand in the months ahead. Firstly, what has driven concerns about a global magnesium shortage? Well, Beijing's rationing of electricity and coal use since the summer has significantly hit magnesium output domestically. China produces around 85% of the world's magnesium. It's particularly energy intensive and coal intensive industry, and so it's become quite a natural target by the authorities for the kind of power rationing and production curbs that we've been used to seeing in recent months. Now, initially you saw around 70% of smelters in Shanxi and Shaanxi provinces halted in late September, and the rest of smelters saw their output curbed by around 50% at that time. So this saw magnesium prices soar to higher than $10,000 a tonne in September. And we also saw, since then in October, we've seen prices retreat a little bit. We'll discuss why that's been the case a little bit later. So what's really the threat of all this to base metals demand? Why should we care in our industry? Well, magnesium is an essential alloying element from aluminium billet and slab production. For example, you can see that in the chart there quite clearly. It's also widely used in die casting alloys, and that's also an important end use sector for zinc. It's not a metal that is particularly easily substituted. It becomes quite difficult to store as well because it starts corroding after a few months, and that means the market more generally is quite vulnerable to supply disruptions like what we're seeing at the moment because of the limited buffer stock that is there in the market because of that corrosion issue. I think it's also important to mention the auto industry is highly dependent on magnesium because of its dependence on aluminium alloys and die casting alloys. And Volvo, for example, has warned of a significant risk to its profitability and output because of that magnesium shortage. You also saw billet producer Metalco come out a few weeks ago and say that ongoing scarcity of magnesium could hit its 2022 output. You also saw the European Aluminium Association warn quite strongly of Europe-wide production shutdowns and manufacturing shutdowns because of this shortage, particularly focused on the aluminium on the automotive sector. So overall, aluminium demand's probably most exposed to this shortage of magnesium, and zinc as well, perhaps to a lesser extent. But I think the key point is that because of the vulnerability of the automotive sector particularly, it's something that could impact demand for all base metals really. Now, in terms of regionally where this could hit, well, I think it's important to note that there's a high dependency on China because obviously it's a high share of global production, but Europe is particularly dependent on China. You can see from the exports there that it's a dominant share of Chinese shipments. The US is not particularly exposed or less exposed than other regions because of its previous anti-dumping tariffs on magnesium from China. So it doesn't really it has its own domestic supply and it's not really reliant on shipments from the country. But I think that there's generally this broader concern about China that it might prioritise its domestic magnesium needs over exports. So China has warned that its magnesium exports could drop by around 10% in 2021. Likely to see that reduction more concentrated, particularly post-September than perhaps earlier this year. So there's a concern because of that dependency on China. I think that's important to reiterate. Now, if we return to the price chart we had up earlier, we can see that the prices have dipped off, and I think that's probably a dual reaction of China's energy crunch starting to ease slightly and some of the provinces there appearing to be past the worst of some of the power rationing they've seen. So, for example, key magnesium producers in Shaanxi are now around 70 to 80% capacity, as reported by SMM. And I think that China is probably also likely to have come under some political pressure from industry and from foreign politicians, from the EU, for example, to try and boost shipments to stave off this risk of severe disruptions that people have been so concerned about. I think just to conclude, really, this magnesium issue is very much tied to China's energy crisis, and that's worth reiterating. And it's yet another example of broader supply chain pressures, such as the shortages of silicon and semiconductors that we've seen earlier this year that have also significantly impacted the automotive sector. I think the signs of the easing China power crisis we've seen because of the collapse in the coal price, for example, in the last few weeks, has been quite important, but we've got to remember that we've got many months of winter ahead, and there's still those risks there of acute shortages of energy and perhaps then of magnesium that are likely to persist really as long as the global shipping crisis and this power rationing issue in China remain a theme and a theme across the space really. So overall, it kind of underscores this reality that while we have seen a huge focus on the impact of energy shortage on supply, I think downstream industry is unlikely to escape the knock-on disruptions from this poor availability of raw material inputs like magnesium because of this energy crisis. So risks to metal demand overall from magnesium shortages and the winter energy shortages may stay alive really, I think, until winter's passed, and we're not likely to see that really abate, I don't think, until perhaps quarter 2 2022. So until then, something very much to keep your eye on. Again, I'd like to thank you all for paying attention to this podcast if you made it to the end, and remind you that if you are interested in receiving our insights and not missing any, to subscribe particularly to our LinkedIn channel, Amalgamated Metal Trading, to receive more of these insights. Thank you.